Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here and accepting our invitation for a coffee. As Agron said, the thematic or the topic of today is symmetry, and I wanted to start my presentation with showing this symbol, this image, that maybe you know or maybe you don't know what it means, but for me it has a certain meaning that I will tell you during the presentation. But for now, what you have to see in this image is that it's a circle, and if we pass an axis through the center of a circle, we will divide it in two equal parts, and this is symmetry. Symmetry is creating two identical parts by dividing element on the two sides. When I was talking about what to do about this presentation, I had suggestions to make it a little more personal and to talk about my experience and my view on symmetry. So I started thinking, when did I first experience symmetry? And I think that me and all of you, we experienced symmetry when we were just created, because we are a cellular being and we are made of cells which are symmetric, and nature by itself, it has a lot of symmetry and we can find it in many aspects of it. So besides not being born yet and being made of a cell, also when I was born, I also was symmetric. My body, my whole being was divided by an axis which made two identical parts. This thing was studied by many. One of them is Vitruvius, and in this image you can see Leonardo da Vinci, that shows how the human body is made of two identical parts. My first impression was that I am a symmetrical person, I'm a symmetrical being. But I also, when I was little, I experienced symmetry with my parents. In a sense, I am the reflection of my parents. So this is a symmetric relation that we have. And in general, family, or my family, is a symmetric relation that everyone reflects their experience and their knowledge to each other. There are some kind of symmetries that are a little more complex, and you can see that sometimes families can be bigger, wider, more people. And this is called complex symmetry, which is not asymmetry, but is just a symmetry that reflects in many ways and many sides. But in general, my family was actually very normal, and I was a very normal, calm kid. I had a social life when I was little. I used to go out in the neighborhood, as we say here, and I had friends. And what I started noticing is that these friends, these people that I used to hang out with, were different from me. They came from different backgrounds, they thought different, they looked different, and this was my first impact with asymmetry, which, going on, I started to understand that asymmetry was something that we can perceive and we can experience in many other ways. Also in school, I was in a very symmetrical system, because the classroom by itself is divided in a symmetrical way, where we have the students sitting in front of the teacher, and we have, besides symmetry, which the teacher is on top of it, we have hierarchy, which the teacher is the leader in this case. I was born and raised in Tirana, and in the city I also experienced symmetry, or I saw symmetry in many places. Generally we can see and we can find symmetry in the center and in the boulevard, because the time that these areas were built were the times of communism and fascism, and symmetry is a very powerful tool that these periods in architecture use to create their designs. But Tirana has also a duality. Besides the symmetry that we see in the center or in the boulevard, we have also this kind of areas which are very asymmetrical. And the asymmetry in this case comes from the visual aspect. We see asymmetry, but also from the date and the time when these buildings were built. And it's common that in Tirana we can walk in a very short distance, and we can experience many areas and many times, many periods of building in the same path. Then growing up, I started to understand better which were my passions, and one of my passions is arts. Maybe this is not one of my favorite images or paintings, but I think it's one of them that represents better how symmetry was used to create a certain mean and to focus in the center. And you can see how all the elements that are spread in the room, all the details that are drawn in this painting, lead to the center, which is the main character of the painting. Another passion of mine is also cinematography and movies, and I found symmetry present in this movie. This is Stanley Kubrick, which uses symmetry to focus and to create a sense of suspense. So maybe you've seen this movie, The Shining. It has a lot of scenes where the characters go through a symmetrical system, and the crossing of the symmetry in the line is the character which is the protagonist of that moment. And you can find this also in another movie of Stanley Kubrick, which is Clockwork Orange. But one of my greatest passions actually is music. And growing up, I played some instruments. Between them, my favorite is the guitar. And while playing it, I understood that what I was playing, somehow it had a kind of repetition. And if we see the repetition in songs, we can also find their symmetry. And in this case, you are seeing the chord progression of Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana. And you can see how we have a center of symmetry in the way that the chords are in this song. Just to show you another example, this is Hey Jude by the Beatles, where we have, again, symmetry, more complex, but you can see the axis that divides the image in two similar parts, two identical parts. So as you see, I started developing a greater liking for geometry. I started being fascinated by geometry and by representing what we see and what we are by sketches. But what geometry means to me, or what I love about geometry, is that we don't only see the objects as objects which are static, but we can also start working with them. We can start doing operations such as moving them, cutting them, shifting them, rotating them, or other kinds of operations which in geometry we have the chance to experiment with them. And I really want to go beyond what we see. But in the end, what I really love is the most simple geometrical shapes, which are these three. And as now, let's say after I grew up a little bit more from when I was a kid, I started to understand, and after reading about geometry, I started to understand that symmetry is not just being made of two identical parts, but actually is the action of reflecting one part to the other side and creating one system, one element. And there is not only one axis, there are many axes that we can play around to create symmetry. And just as a reference, these are four kinds of symmetry: mirror symmetry, axial symmetry, cyclic symmetry, and repetitive symmetry. So reading more and more, I started to understand that I wanted to know more about geometry and about symmetry. So I decided to study architecture, because I thought that architecture is a very good chance for me and a very good platform for me to play around with shapes and to play around with geometry. So I went to Polish University of Architecture, which is a very inspiring environment, and I met there many of my friends. And actually I met there many of my mentors, which I learned a lot from them. And my first impact with the school was, as I said, the environment, but also the classroom. You can see that it's similar, the auditorium is similar to the classroom that I showed you in the beginning when I was little. But in this case, we have the teacher, again, as a hierarchy, and the symmetry is similar. But in this case, I can choose where to sit. And I can choose the classes that I want to attend. And the classes that I want to attend are the ones that I love to learn about them. So I was very passionate about my university years. One of the classes that started in the first year of architecture is history of architecture. And there I also encountered symmetry. And I found out that symmetry was used long time ago. And this is Stonehenge, is a structure which is in UK. And if we see it from the top, we can find an axis of symmetry. And this way we understand that many years ago, people used to use symmetry as a tool to create a space. And they used to associate it also with bigger images, and they used to associate it with religion or with something that is unknown. A better reference maybe that all of you know is the pyramids, which there are many theories of the composition of the pyramids by themselves, or the way that they are put together, and the symmetry that they create with each other. And another example that was studied about symmetry, and that symmetry was applied, are the Greek temples. If we see the facades of the Greek temples, we can find the symmetry in many ways, which sometimes gets very complex. But in Greek temples we can find also another aspect of geometry, and if we start reading them, we understand that they are using this kind of module. And this is called the golden ratio, or the golden section, where, according to the Greeks, they thought that this was the perfect module to create the best aesthetic outcome out of geometry. Then, learning more about history, I understood that not only in Europe, but everywhere in the world, we can find symmetry, and especially in important or religious buildings. So you can see that no matter where you are, in different continents and in different periods, and people didn't even have a way to communicate with each other, symmetry was used as a way to represent beauty. One example of symmetry can be the San Pietro Square and Church in Rome, where we have a very planar symmetry, or a very horizontal symmetry. And this is the picture of the plaza, but we can see here the plan of this church, and we can see that from the church till the plaza is a very complex system of symmetry, and the axis is always the center. Then we have another kind of symmetry that again comes from a religious building, which is the vertical, and in this case is the facade of the Notre de Paris, which has again a very complex symmetry on the details and all the architectural elements that it's made of. So this was like my proof that in religion, symmetry was very important. But then I started to understand that not only in religion, but also in other kinds of structures and other kinds of buildings, symmetry was used for new and different means. For example, in the Eiffel Tower, symmetry was used to create a building which, for the time, was very different from anything that everyone had ever seen. And it was very complex from the architecture, but also from the engineering point of view. And in this case, we have a central symmetry. Another example of symmetry is interpretation of an Italian city, or small city or town, which usually Italian towns have a center, or the square, the main center of the city. They have the roads that lead to the center, and usually you can find areas that are more green in the outskirts. In this case, the project is called the Ideal City, where it's made out of symmetry, and everything leads to the hexagonal center. And going in the radial way outside, you can see how everything is spread according to this symmetry. And streets are the lines or the axes that create the symmetry. But besides that city, which, as you saw, was symmetric from the top, but when you go there, you don't really perceive the symmetry. I wanted to show you this project that was made in the 18th century. It's by a French architect called Etienne Boulet, and it's the Cenotaph of Isaac Newton. The Cenotaph is a building or a monument which is made after the death of someone to commemorate him. You can see that here we have again central symmetry, radial symmetry. There are these circles which lead to the center. But what is special about this building is that we don't only find the symmetry of the circle on the plan, but it's also in the section or in the front view. So this is a sphere. And for the 18th century, where the style that was in that time was more classical and it's not expected to something like this, this is something very avant-garde, and it was never built, but it's a project which really stands for its time. As you may know, another way that symmetry was used was to give the sense of power and give the sense of order. And one way that it was used was by the Nazi Party, by the architect of Hitler, Albert Speer, where he was asked to design Berlin, the new Berlin. And the way that he started his design, his final proposal was a central boulevard, very symmetrical, that leads to the two main buildings of the city. And on the sides, we have also other important buildings. It reminds us of another boulevard that we might have walked in, like Tirana Boulevard. But besides the sense of power, the symmetry is used also to give a sense of beauty. And in this case, we have a building which the symmetry is the main tool of the composition. And we can see how symmetry communicates with perspective. And it creates this beautiful landscape which doesn't have any nature. It's all concrete. You can see the minimalistic way of designing the buildings, and the floor is also made of these concrete tiles. And the architect, Louis Kahn, he just finished his design of the buildings, of the square, everything, but he needed to do the vegetation. He needed to work on the plants, the trees. So he went to a landscape architect, a very famous landscape architect, to ask him for help of how to put the trees in this place. And when the architect saw it, he said, "You don't need to put anything. It's perfect." And just imagine if here there were trees and if here there were other things that interrupt this beautiful scenario, it wouldn't be the same. So this is why, in this case, symmetry and perspective are the main tool of the composition. We have also more complex symmetry. In this case, is Calatrava and the center of Valencia, where symmetry is made out of many elements, and we can find symmetry not just in one axis, but in many axes that come in different dimensions. Calatrava is famous because he uses symmetry as he uses his designs, and he is inspired by the human and the nature, and the body structure and the bone structure. So you can see how the complexity comes from another point of view. But then we come down to a more calm down scenario. In this case, it's a church in Japan, designed by Tadao Ando. And as we saw in the beginning of the presentation, the churches had a lot to do with symmetry. But it was a symmetry that was complex and made of many elements to give the idea of the church as a powerful institution. And in this case, we have something which is quite the opposite. We have a symbol, which is the cross, which is, of course, very present in Christianity. And that's the only element of decoration. Everything else is made out of concrete and the benches and the wood floor. There is nothing else. And this cross is not just carved in the wall, but is the way that the light comes in. So we have here again a very powerful tool of symmetry to create the design of this building. But then I saw during my studies, I found out that many people started to think of buildings and of churches in a different way. And this is a small chapel designed by Peter Zumter, which is actually a very asymmetrical shape. It has an opening in the inside that you can see the light coming in, as you see on the left. And it only has an altar where you can pray, and the structure is made out of burned wood. So I started thinking that if this is a church, why cannot everything be different? Why do we have to make churches and other buildings just like they have been made before? But this is actually everything you need for a church. You can pray, you can see the light, you can put your candle, you can sit down. And why we cannot expand our minds and do something that hasn't been done before? So I started to understand that asymmetry is something that fascinates me much more than symmetry. And I find it much more interesting, and it gives me a lot of creative freedom to work with asymmetry. In this case, it's a painting of Mondrian, who is a Dutch designer, painter, who was painting for many years a tree. He was painting that tree in many ways. He did many copies of that painting. He started painting in many styles, but he was never accomplished with the way that he was drawing that tree. And in the end, he came up with this design, with this style, which he said, this is a painting and this is a tree, or this can be the window of a church. Why not? And for the time, for the beginning of the 20th century, this was quite a courageous move to make this kind of design, which is very simple, very minimalistic. The three main colors are blue, yellow, and green, and red, which also gives a sense of Trinity, because Mondrian was also religious, and he used the Trinity, the three main colors, to represent his painting. And he said, I don't need anything else or anything more than this to make a painting. And this and other paintings and other arts that were done in that time opened the doors to two new schools and to new movements, such as the Style and Bauhaus, where they have similarities and they work with simple shapes, with basic shapes, triangle, circle, square, with the colors. The colors are simple colors. There is not there is not a variety of colors, but they keep it basic, and that is also the essence of their theory, to keep it basic. And this was also seen in architecture in the modernist time. This is a building of Le Corbusier, where we can see how a building which is very strict, it looks very brutalistic, made of this raw concrete, is not symmetric. You have this line here and this line here, which shift the symmetry. It makes it asymmetric. And the reason why this is asymmetric is because it doesn't need to be symmetric. There is no reason for it to be symmetric. And modernism is also led by function. The designs were led by making the building functional. And in this case, the function needed to create an asymmetric building. So we have this kind of composition. Then we have another kind of asymmetry, which, if you look at it, it looks symmetrical, or let's say the general picture is symmetrical, but inside of it there is asymmetry. And this is to give aesthetics. This is Mies van der Rohe, and he uses a lot of asymmetry in his designs, and the shapes that he makes are very simple but very aesthetic, and just the basic that you need to create a building. Then we have another case where a building which is totally asymmetric and it has a shape that is very hard to define. The result of this is pure function. It's a shape that ignores aesthetics, ignores the way how it should look, but the function that is inside, it's a library in Seattle. That's the driving force of creating the main shape. Then you have a building that I guess all of you have seen, that I just want you to imagine if this was a symmetrical building. It wouldn't have the same power, it wouldn't have the same impact that it has on people, and it wouldn't be as famous that it is now if we had a symmetrical building in this case. Then we have another very inspiring architect and monument for me. It's the Jewish Memorial in Berlin, where we see these slabs, these shapes of concrete that are spread all over the place. And the general composition is something like this. And when you walk through it, it feels like you're in a labyrinth. But actually, everything is very straight. Things are defined by a very simple grid. But the way that it works is that the height of these elements, these concrete elements, change and gives you the sense of being lost. Then here is another inspiring building for me, and a very inspiring architect, or let's say a very inspiring country, Japan, where architects focus on the aesthetic and the purity of the structure and of the building. And this is a building from So Fujimoto. You might know him for the cloud that is in front of the Gallery of Arts. In this case, he designed these structures, which are by themselves, the facades are asymmetrical, and they have each of them a different composition of the windows, which is led by the function. But what fascinates me the most is looking at it from the plan. We can see how the shapes are scattered around. And what I wanted to know about this is why they are like this. Why everything is turned in this way and not in another way. And I understood that it's just pure composition. And it gives a variety that creates very interesting shapes, squares, scenarios inside of this plan. And by looking at this image, I started to understand that we have to see beyond what we see. And I started looking at the city a little more different. And I started noticing some elements which broke the symmetry of the city. Tirana had a period in communism where many residential buildings were built in a very rational style, usually very symmetric. But after the 90s, when communism fell down, we had these structures that were attached to these buildings, and they broke the symmetry. They made these buildings asymmetrical. The reasons why this happened, there are many. It's the chaotic moment after communism. It's the lack of space. Everyone came in Tirana and everyone needed more space. And what I wanted to do is to understand more of this phenomena, and I started mapping this parasitic architecture, these structures that are attached to other buildings. And I found out there are actually 5 ways how these people that are not architects, they are just owners of an apartment, they made some kind of system how to add this, how to add space to their apartment. And then from this I started thinking how I can design a building that incorporates the concept of addition, or the concept of removing a space or recombining the space inside the building without the need of changing the structure. So I started analyzing the functions and the needs of the users during the day, during the week, during the year, to understand better how everything works. I started spreading them in the context, so I have another factor, which is the context that is around me, as a way to make me understand how to design this building better. And the final outcome was a building which is made out of, let's say, containers or modules that you can move, and you can recreate the space however the user needs it. This is just a picture. This is my diploma thesis. Thank you. This is my diploma thesis, and from the outside I really wanted to put this in the Albanian context because it's a new way of thinking of architecture. And coming from a background that we did additions, we had a lot of informality, I think that this kind of architecture can be present in our city. And although it looks from the outside like every other building with this big facades and big building, in the inside there is a very green space and a place that you can lay down, play guitar, and do whatever you feel like. And these public spaces with greenery spread on different layers and on different heights of the building. But until now, as you can see, my life was quite symmetric. Everything was going the right way. I was in a full-time job teaching. I just finished my architecture degree. Everything was fine. Until I saw this. This is actually a building that since I was little, I used to pass by because I live close here. And going to school, I used to love the building because I loved the arch in the front. I couldn't see what was inside, but I was always fascinated by it. And then me and 3 other colleagues and friends decided to take this place, renovate it, and make it something different. From the inside, when we first entered, it was something like this. It was completely not usable. It was full of mud. On the inside, the space was, you didn't have electricity, you didn't have running water, so we had to do all the restoration. And the final outcome looks something like this, which is a very asymmetrical design, but the concept was to incorporate in the steel many functions, from the cafeteria, from the outside garden that you can stay in under the trees, the hostel, the workspace, and also a space which we call the alternative space, where you can come and do an exhibition or do a talk or do a speech or basically just expose your work. And this was the main reason why the steel was created, to give a platform to people to expose their work and to interact with each other. Another thing that happened in the steel and that we organized here was the Sound, which is a musical festival and competition for indie music, which is very unknown and not you cannot find it in the radio or in the TV in Albania. And we did this initiative, which was great, and we made this festival with 24 bands that played indie rock music. And in this moment I started to understand that my symmetry was shifting. I was experiencing new things. I was working not only in architecture, but I was working in exhibitions, I was working with music, I was working with organizing speeches. So I was in a very confused moment because my symmetry was broken and I wasn't clear what I was doing. And time for me was quite condensed because I had a lot of things going on and I couldn't handle all of them. So I changed my contract with the school and I was not a full-time teacher anymore. I was part-time, so I could focus on my second master's on design. So I started my second master's, and during the classes I started to understand that composition and geometry is not just in architecture, it's not just in the shapes and how we interact with them, but we can find it anywhere. We can find it in graphic design, we can find it in everyday life. And by finishing my master's, I started working in graphic design. I created my studio, which is called Void, and it's architecture and graphic design, which is the blending of the two main things that I love and I do with passion. And by doing this, I got the chance to work online. I got the chance to work with US or other countries that are not here, and all I needed was a computer. I needed a computer, internet, and I could be anywhere in the world and work for my projects. So this gave me the chance to get more experience. This gave me the chance to explore nature. This gave me the chance to go and see some of my favorite buildings or monuments, to go in the desert, to travel, to play guitar. Everything that I wanted to do, I finally had the chance to do it. And I understood that the only way that I can do it is through an asymmetrical system. And I understand that I am living a very asymmetrical life, and I really enjoy it because asymmetry is associated for me with the unexpected, and I have a very unexpected future, and it's fine for me. And I don't really need symmetry, except of one thing. I need symmetry in love and in relations, but not in anything else. Thank you.